A warning, this podcast deals with sensitive topics including porn, suicide and sexual assault.
Westville High School student Francesca Mani never thought her photo would appear online in a deepfake, an AI-generated image using her likeness. But it happened.
I never thought I'd be like a student. AI didn't even come to my mind. I just thought it would be like creeps on the internet.
And she has learned it might not just be one kid, it might have been a group of boys using upwards of a dozen girls' images to make AI pornography.
Pornographic deepfakes in schools, of students, by students. It's rife and it's devastating.
This man is accused and was convicted of taking images of girls he knew in high school, superimposing them on other women's bodies in sexually explicit poses. It's called deep faking.
Depravity on display by this defendant truly makes my skin crawl.
But alarmingly, this isn't just an American issue, it's happening here in New Zealand, in our classrooms, with our students.
I have a couple of my colleagues who have had to work through some fairly dark stuff with regard to deepfake pornography and swathes of their students' images, fake images of their students being broadcast all over the internet, which is just incredibly difficult to deal with.
Kia ora, I'm Amanda Gillies, and on The Detail today, artificial intelligence gone bad in our classrooms. Put simply, pornographic deepfakes is a form of online bullying using AI. And how it works is simple. Deepfakes create a sexual image of a person, in this case a student, normally female, doing or saying things they haven't actually said or done.
They're real, right? They look real. Whilst the individual knows that they're not, they're pretty accurate. So everyone has a fairly good idea of what people may or may not look like in a certain circumstance, and that brings a sense of shame and embarrassment, and then you don't want to reconnect back with school because you think everyone's talking about you. So it's just incredibly challenging for students from a mental health perspective when they are the victim of such a thing.
That's Secondary Principals Association President Vaughan Queo, who says the problem is only getting worse in New Zealand schools. He spoke to our producer, Davina Zimmer.
Well, it used to be zero because it didn't happen. So it's gone from zero to many pretty quickly. So you'd have to say, yes, it is getting worse. Is it epidemic? No, but is it easy for someone who is a little bit tech savvy and has the motivation? Is it easy for them to do? Yes. However, it hasn't got away on us yet. However, the other however is, even though it hasn't got away on us yet, there have still been hundreds of people that have been affected by deep fake imagery that isn't them, that are hurt and broken and may not have had the chance to get the support they need to get back to fully functioning. So any one of these incidents can be significantly damaging and have lifelong implications for the person on the other end of it. So, yeah, I don't think it's happening every 5 minutes. However, the IT guys in places like N4L or CERT or NetSafe might have a different view. They might see it far more regularly than I do.
It's a concern. It's a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a problem, and I suppose that's where we get our legislature to step in to create consequences that are the deterrent that we need, because the tool isn't going away. The tool to create it isn't going away. However, we probably need to legislate around, if we haven't done so already, around what those penalties look like in terms of harmful digital communication.
How easy is it to catch these students who are creating these deepfake images, and run me through what kind of punishments there are for them?
Yeah, look, from a school perspective, right? So if it's a school-based incident, the punishment side of it is anything ranging from restorative conversation and mediation with the family through to suspension that leads to either exclusion or expulsion, right? So that's the tools that schools have got available to them. And so with any particular discipline event, there's never if you do this will definitely be the outcome. It's got to be every case is dealt with on its own merits, for want of a better phrase. However, this type of situation, in my experience, will be at the higher end. So you're probably talking about suspensions and going before the board, and handing that information on to either internal affairs or the police. Because if you're doing a deep fake of a 13-year-old girl, that probably falls into the category of objectionable and obscene, which we need to notify internal affairs about as well. So there's all sorts of criminal and civil stuff tied up in there. And so how easy is it? From what I haven't explored that personally myself, but I have seen a couple of articles on various documentaries about how easy it is if you know what the right product is, or you get yourself into the space on the dark web where you can download the software that does stuff. So it's easy to get to the software. It's not so easy to intervene if the access to the internet is not done through the school network. So it's pretty easy relatively easy to tie down a school network and say where kids can and can't go, whereas most of the generation of this is, metaphorically speaking, the 15-year-old boy sitting in his bedroom while his parents are out and about. They've got a high trust situation with regard to their internet content or the internet policing in the family. And the young fella's left to his own devices, and off he goes on his unlimited bandwidth at home.
Yeah, so it's not actually, if it doesn't happen in schools, there's not really all that much teachers or the school can do about it. Is that what you're saying?
The preventative action in terms of internet access is very, very challenging, because you don't get a whole lot of kids sitting in maths generating deepfake porn. It hasn't happened yet. And even with the use of VPNs and all of that sort of stuff, actually kids just tell on each other anyway. So most of you rely on the good kids, and they do. I haven't seen any evidence of that. However, the sharing, the airdropping, here's a photo of that we saw on the net, the screenshot, that could happen at school, but that happens in the Bluetooth space, not in the school network space. So again, very challenging to police. I can get a photo to you, airdrop it to you, send it on WeChat or WhatsApp or whatever, and it completely circumvents our school network and ability to intervene. And so, it's not something that we can easily put a dam in front of.
Let's talk about the mental toll that this has on the students who are victim of these deep fakes. Tell me about that.
I can only sort of give you secondhand conversation I've had with a good colleague of mine who, on his campus, there was about 40 or 50 young women who fell victim to deep fake porn situation. They were all in the senior end of secondary school. And the young person involved on the other side of that was a little bit younger. And just that sense of embarrassment, that sense of shame, that inability to reconnect back into school, sort of metaphorically speaking, knowing everyone's seeing you naked when you didn't want that to be the case, just incredibly challenging. And there are some people that would deal with that relatively quickly and easily. Fine, that happened, let's get on with it. I may or may need additional support from a counselling perspective or not. And there's others who, for whatever their circumstances are, may not be able to cope with that quite so well. And it's not something that's going to go away in 7 days. It's something that may indeed come back and circle back, and they see that photo again 5-10 years later. And it's just brutal, and it's challenging to get through. And you think about the different cultures that we have in our country and the different values that those cultures place on protecting or covering their young women, there would be significant risk to person for many of our young women that are exposed to this stuff. To be fair, the victims are mostly our young women, and society's been treating women poorly for millennia, and this is just another way that our menfolk can get it wrong.
So legally, what's in place to protect our students? How do we talk to our kids about this? What are the long-term implications? Why do young men do it? Well, for those answers, I spoke to sex therapist and parent consultant Jo Robertson from Make Sense, an organisation advocating for a safer digital space for our children.
Most of the time it's women and girls. So 96% of deep fakes will be of women and girls, and 90% of those are of porn or sexual content and non-consensually made. So we've got essentially image-based sexual abuse of women and girls, and it is in the classrooms, absolutely. We're seeing a lot of cases of that overseas, and we know that it's happening here. We don't have the research yet to say how often, and women and girls are also most likely to keep that a secret. They don't like going to the police over it or making kind of more of a deal than, or getting more attention than it already has been, if that makes sense. So we don't have really robust data here in New Zealand, but we know that it's really significant all around the world.
The psychological toll, Jo, the mental and emotional fallout from this, how brutal is it?
It's actually exactly the same as if they were to experience in-person sexual abuse. So in society, we tend to put it as like a kind of like a lower grade. And I heard this really great phrase once, which was that there's no hierarchy in trauma. And it's absolutely the case here. So just because it's online, it doesn't mean that it's less real or less painful. And in fact, what's more painful about it is that the threat of that image, video, or recording is there forever, that there's no certainty that that encounter or that moment is gone from their lives, that they could go for a teacher's job interview in 5 years' time and have someone search their name on Google and then find that image of them. So it hangs over them for sometimes much longer than maybe an in-person encounter does.
Gosh, that's awful. And I can just imagine young, vulnerable girls. Is it driving them, do you think, maybe to suicide? Is it getting that far just yet?
Well, I would imagine so. I mean, I'm using, I guess, client experiences to inform that judgment, that when we feel violated, we often want to escape the deep pain of that. And we can escape into lots of things. We can escape into alcohol, we can escape into drugs, we can actually escape into things like shopping or TV or phones, but we can also escape by making ourselves absent in this world. And we know that a particularly vulnerable group are those who are further exploited over those images. So they are then threatened to create more, to do more. They are threatened financially. And so there's a piece of research actually in the UK, and that was that 25% of women who had an explicit image of them shared, whether it was real or fake, were then threatened with those images into, some other kind of behavior. I guess what I want people to know is that this is really, really traumatic, and it's traumatic for an extremely long time, and we're not well set up for it here in New Zealand.
I want to talk about that because is our government doing enough? What are the legal sort of protections currently in place for our young students against these deep fakes?
It's a little bit ambiguous, and that's where the problem lies, is that there's ambiguity. It's grey. So we've got the Harmful Digital Communications Act that essentially was designed to address anything that happens digitally through technology or online that is harmful to another person. And intent is quite important there, so that it was intended to harm and that it's created emotional distress. So it's not where someone did something by accident and another person thought it was a bit funny. It was done to make them feel some pain, or it was done without any forethought and the person felt incredible pain as a result. So it's not really clear in the HDCA, that Harmful Digital Communications Act, if those images need to be realistic or if they can be created. So it's ambiguous. The Law Association just this year in 2024 has said that they think it's a problem, that it doesn't recognise created images rather than real, and they pushed for the HDCA to be amended, but that was declined. So there's kind of mixed opinions. Some people say, oh yeah, we absolutely have classification for that. And others are like, no, it's not clear. And when something is not clear, it means people fall between the cracks.
And that's the last thing you want, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But the other bit there that's concerning for me, particularly as a therapist, is that we have ACC sensitive claims free therapy, which is fantastic for anybody who's experienced sexual harm. But it is not clear whether that harm needs to have happened in person or it can have happened online. And the problem about it being ambiguous, so it's not in their list of criteria, so to speak. So a client would need to go to an ACC therapist, explain their situation, and it's kind of a special case needs to be made. And that's a problem because a therapist is not always going to take that initiative because they might be under the idea that it's not going to be meet criteria. But it also makes the person feel less validated, like, oh, my thing isn't on the list. And as a result, I'm not really seen. So we've got a gap and ambiguity in whether something can be prosecuted or something can be criminal. And then we've got a gap in whether somebody can actually get help for that.
In an ideal world, what would you want changed? What do you want to see happen?
I think it needs to be really clear, both in the law, but then also in education. So it's one thing to put it in a piece of policy and, that if and when it ever happens to somebody that they know something can be done about it. But it's another whole thing to actually do prevention work and to talk about that in classrooms or to talk about that with your young people, to talk about it in workplaces, communities, whatever. That's a whole other piece. And we don't do prevention particularly well in New Zealand. We tend to address harm, particularly when it comes to sexual violence, rather than prevention.
What's your advice for teachers? Because, they sign up to do reading, writing and arithmetic, basically teach your ABCs, and this is a whole AI world. It's advancing fast. What's your advice for them when it comes to deep fakes in the AI world?
Well, I don't think every single teacher in the school needs to be fully upskilled in this space. If you're teaching maths, it's unlikely that child is going to disclose to you that deepfake was made of them. However, if you have a really great rapport with your students, then it's more likely. However, our health, our PE teachers, anybody in pastoral care, our deans, anybody in leadership, those people are all more likely to be told about something that's happening. And as a result, it would be great if they would just know how to manage the conversation. And sometimes that just means a lot of empathy and care. In the same way that if somebody told you that their parents were splitting up and it was, really creating a lot of pain for them, empathy and care just goes a long way. And you can say, hey, I'm not 100% sure what to do here, but I'm going to get some really great advice and we're going to make a plan. Or what would you like me to do about that? There's a few phrases actually that just change young people's lives. But I do think there are some things we need to be saying in our health or sexuality curriculum. And there's a lot of good stuff in our curriculum, but it doesn't often translate into the classroom. So there's things that are written into that, which are phenomenal. But if a teacher doesn't feel confident in saying those things, then they're not going to. And as a result, we're going to have some uneducated young people. So they often don't know, for example, that if they distribute an image of another student who's under 18, that's the distribution of child sexual abuse material, that's actually a crime. And they don't know that. And it needs to be treated as seriously as that.
How are you? Which brings me to, why do they, and they are mainly young boys, why do these young boys do it?
I think that their brains are not fully developed. I think they lack foresight. They are highly impulsive. They don't understand risk. They probably lack some empathy. And all of that stuff can actually be built on, but it's only going to be built on through conversation. Like that's the only pathway. And it's just not happening. It's just not happening with parents. It's not happening in the classrooms at the level that it needs to. We've got a really significant issue around young people strangling each other during sex as another example. And nobody's saying that out loud. So we kind of want them to change, but we're not really willing to talk about it in order for the change to happen.
She says sex education has to start early, even in primary school, and conversations have to be open and supportive.
Yeah, you've got to confront it. The biggest category now of child sexual abuse material online is of 7 to 10-year-olds. And 70% of that, it gets worse, 70% of that is self-created.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. And there's been a 1,000% increase since 2019. So when it makes us uncomfortable, there's actually not a good enough reason not to act. And their safety is more important than our discomfort. Those children are not taking photos in a lounge. They're not taking photos when a parent's around. They're being given devices and they're going into private spaces and they're being groomed and exploited online. So you have to confront that. You have to confront that research and those stats, because otherwise nothing will change and those stats will continue to grow and children will continue to be exploited. So we need to talk about devices, we need to talk about safety, we need to talk about nude images. And unfortunately, it is actually important to talk about that at a primary school or a child level, unless your kids are never alone with a device. And then you can probably wait a few more years.
Find me that child. Are they being groomed by older people or kids of the same age? Like, God, they are babies, Joe.
Yeah, usually adults. So usually adults and a really significant group in North America. So not, what some people might imagine, but there's regular adults who live in communities, maybe similar to the parents who live in communities who are listening to this, and they're grooming and exploiting kids. And kids are taking those photos themselves, not because they're being naughty, but because they're being threatened or they think they're in a genuine relationship with someone. I spoke with a 9-year-old and this year who said she had a boyfriend online that she met through her PlayStation.
Oh, dear God.
And I said, how do you know if they are an adult or a child? And she said, I don't know. I found a way of communicating that back to her parent, who I didn't know, but I found a way of getting that information back. And they just had no idea that the PlayStation was giving her the ability to talk to strangers online. And she was able to do that, in a private space at home. It's devastating that our kids are in this position. It's devastating that we would have to have this conversation. But again, our own discomfort does not trump their safety.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. Thank you to Joe Robertson and Vaughan Quio. This episode was engineered by Phil Benj and produced by Davina Zimmer and Gwen McClure. I'm Amanda Gillies. Mā te wā.